Before we dive in, I'd like to ask a small favor. I'm pouring all my energy into reaching my goal of 1,000 subscribers, which means the world to me. Please, I'm asking you to hit that subscribe button. It's just a single click, but it gives me tremendous motivation to keep creating more videos. Thank you so much.
The instruction was penned in the same decisive hand that signed leases and dismissed tenants. 3 lines, stark and unadorned. No greeting, no farewell, only the initial BS pressed into the paper at the bottom, a signature imbued with the practiced efficiency of a man who expected no dissent. Remove the Duchess of Denim from the guest list for the Fairborn Ball. Confirm when completed. Mr. Ives read it twice, not for clarity. The words were brutally precise, but for the brief reprieve the second reading afforded him, a sliver of time to compose the expression he would wear upon looking up. He settled on an utter blankness. He folded the note, tucked it into his ledger, and declared, "Very good, Your Grace." The words were directed to the empty doorway, through which the Duke of Denim had already departed. The missive had arrived on a Tuesday. The Fairborn Ball was slated for Saturday. In the intervening days lay a span that should have been more than ample for a competent secretary to execute a simple social erasure. For 11 years he had managed the Duke's correspondence flawlessly, navigated the treacherous currents of political dinners, diplomatic refusals, and the particular, delicate cruelty of declining invitations on behalf of men who held seats beside the Duke in the House of Lords. He was not a man who failed at tasks. Yet this task felt different in his hands. He knew, as did everyone in the household, that the Duchess had been residing at the Dower House since the previous autumn. 8 months. Her departure had been devoid of drama. No overheard arguments by servants, no scenes enacted at dinner, no trunk-laden carriage rattling away into the night. She had simply, over the course of several weeks, relocated her books, her writing desk, her morning tea service, and finally herself to the stone cottage nestled at the eastern edge of the estate. The great house had absorbed her absence with the quiet, unnoticed assimilation of a body absorbing a wound that had yet to reveal its fatal nature. The Duke had not commented on it, not once. He had continued his routine, the House of Lords during parliamentary sessions, the estate through autumn, his study in winter, as though her relocation were a mere architectural adjustment, not a marital fissure, as though she had simply moved to a different room. Mr. Ives understood, in the way that those who serve powerful households come to understand without explicit instruction, that the Duke's directive concerning the guest list was not born of cruelty. It was born of embarrassment. Barnaby Stowe did not wish to be seated beside a woman he had driven away, not in front of the 300 eyes that would be watching for precisely that. He did not wish the county to witness the chasm between them measured in the echoing silence across a supper table. Embarrassment, Mr. Ives reflected, staring at the folded note within his ledger, was often a more potent force than cruelty. Cruelty, at least, acknowledged the existence of the other person. He wrote to Lady Fairborn's secretary on Wednesday. The letter was composed with meticulous care, citing a scheduling conflict and suggesting the Duchess might be indisposed. It was dispatched by the afternoon post. On Thursday the reply arrived, not from the secretary, but from Lady Fairborn herself, penned on cream-colored paper in a hand that disdained diplomacy. "My dear Mr. Ives," it read, "the invitation was issued by me, and it stands. I do not discuss my guest list with secretaries. If His Grace has concerns, he may raise them with me directly, and I shall enjoy the conversation enormously." Mr. Ives read the letter, folded it, and placed it in a drawer he rarely opened. He did not inform the Duke that the instruction had failed. He told himself he was waiting for an appropriate moment. The appropriate moment never arrived. By Friday evening, as the household began its preparations for the ball, the note remained in its drawer, and Mr. Ives sat with it, a silent, unmoving tableau. At the Dower House, the invitation had arrived on Wednesday morning. Cecily Stowe read it at the small writing desk she had positioned beneath the window, angled deliberately away from the great house. The placement was so pointed that even Mrs. Quelch, who had served the family for 19 years and cultivated the art of noticing nothing, had taken note. The invitation was penned in Lady Fairborn's own hand, That alone was enough for Cecily to understand everything. Formal invitations were the domain of secretaries. Personal ones were extended by friends who grasped that they were offering not merely a seat at a table, but a choice. She laid the card on the desk and gazed at it for a long time. Through the window, she could hear the gardener, sent by Farron, she suspected, though neither man would ever admit it, tending the beds along the cottage wall. The roses were coming into bloom. She had planted the bulbs herself in November, pushing them into the cold earth with bare hands because there had been no one to tell her not to, and the simple act of kneeling in the mud had felt, for the first time in months, like something she had chosen rather than something she had endured. 8 months. She had not counted them deliberately. The passage of time had simply happened to her, like weather, marking itself against windows and walls, whether one willed it or not. 8 months since the last evening she had sat across from Barnaby at dinner and understood with the quiet certainty of a woman who had spent 4 years deciphering a man's silences that he was not going to speak. Not that evening, not the next, not because he was angry or wounded, but because he had simply ceased to find the effort worthwhile. She had not wept. She had not confronted him. She had done what women of her station had done for centuries, when the architecture of a marriage revealed itself to be decorative rather than structural. She had found a smaller room and made it her own. But the invitation was not a room, it was a door. She replied on Thursday. One line, in her own hand, "I shall be delighted to attend." On Saturday afternoon, she opened the wardrobe in the Dower House bedroom. It was smaller than the one she had left behind, holding fewer gowns, each one chosen with the deliberation of a woman who understood that what she had kept mattered more than what she had relinquished. The silver silk lay at the back. She had not worn it since the season before her marriage, when she had been Cecily Wren, and the world had not yet decided what to do with her. It still fit. She was not surprised. She had changed in every way that mattered, save for the physical ones, which were, she reflected as she fastened the pearl strand at her throat, the ones that mattered least. Mrs. Quelch appeared in the doorway as Cecily was arranging her hair. The housekeeper remained silent for a moment, having learned over 19 years of service that the most valuable contribution a servant could make was often nothing at all. Then she spoke. "Will you require the carriage brought round, Your Grace? For 8:30, if you please." "Shall I inform the great house?" Cecily met her eyes in the mirror. The question held within it several others, none of which Mrs. Quelch would voice directly, and all of which Cecily understood. "No," she replied, "I do not believe the great house requires informing." Mrs. Quelch nodded, adjusted a fold in the gown that needed no adjustment, and left the room. Cecily sat for a long time before the mirror, gazing at a woman she had not seen in 8 months. The Duchess of Denim, dressed for a ball, pearls at her throat, her composure so profound it might have been mistaken for indifference by anyone who did not comprehend the cost. On Saturday evening the Fairbourne estate blazed. 300 candles in the ballroom chandeliers, another 100 in the sconces along the corridors. From the drive, it appeared as a house that had swallowed the sun and held it captive behind glass. Carriages lined the approach for a quarter-mile. The county had turned out in force. This was Lady Fairbourne's annual ball, the benchmark against which all other social occasions in the district measured themselves, and absence from it was noted with the precision of an accountant marking a debt. The Duke of Denim arrived at 8:30. He was impeccably dressed, a dark tailcoat, a white cravat tied with architectural precision, a waistcoat of dove-gray silk that seemed to catch and hold the candlelight. He greeted Lady Fairbourne in the receiving line with the controlled warmth of a man who understood that social performance was a form of governance, and he executed it with practiced skill. He took his place in the ballroom, accepted a glass of champagne from a footman whose name he did not know, and surveyed the room with the satisfaction of a man who believed he had dictated the evening's terms. The chair beside him was empty. Protocol demanded it remain so. The Duchess's seat at any formal occasion was at her husband's right hand. He had fully expected it to remain empty all evening, a deliberate void in the seating arrangement, to be noted, wondered at, and ultimately absorbed into the general understanding that the Duke of Denim's marriage was a private matter, one that polite society would respect by refraining from discussion until the carriage ride home. Cecily arrived at 9. She entered through the main doors, not the garden entrance. She wore a gown of pale silver silk, its empire waist designed to catch the light with each step, so that she appeared to carry her own illumination. Her hair was dressed simply, a single strand of pearls at her throat, and gloves of unbroken white kid leather that reached above her elbows. She looked, Lady Fairborn observed from her vantage point near the doorway, exactly like a woman who had spent 8 months deciding what to wear to her own reappearance and had chosen, with devastating accuracy, the appearance of someone who had not thought about it at all. The room noticed, not all at once. A ballroom of 300 does not turn as a single entity, but in stages, like a current moving through water. A murmur near the door, a turned head, then another, then a silence that spread outward from the entrance like ripples from a stone, until it reached the far wall where the Duke of Denim stood with his champagne, his carefully orchestrated evening, and his empty chair. He saw her. The glass did not tremble in his hand. His expression did not falter, but his body shifted, a fractional quarter turn towards the door, which he corrected almost immediately. As though his muscles had betrayed an instinct his mind had swiftly overruled. He watched her cross the room. She did not look at him. She greeted Lady Fairborn with a kiss on both cheeks, a continental, intimate gesture that announced to every observer in the room precisely whose invitation had brought her here. She accepted a glass of champagne. She smiled at the Countess of Braswell, who had been watching the entrance with the avidity of a woman who understood that the evening had just become significantly more interesting. Then, she walked to the empty chair beside the Duke of Denim and sat down. She did not ask permission. She did not acknowledge the 8 months. She simply gathered her skirts with the practiced economy of a woman who had been sitting in formal chairs since she was 16, lowered herself into the seat that was hers by marriage, by protocol, and by the immovable fact of English social law, and arranged her hands in her lap. "Good evening, Your Grace," she said, her voice carried precisely far enough to be heard by the 3 nearest guests, and no further. The Duke looked at his wife. She looked at the room. The distance between those 2 gazes contained the entire history of their marriage, and everyone who witnessed it understood. He could not ask her to leave. The realization settled over him like a gathering storm, not sudden but total. She was the Duchess of Denim. This was a formal ball. Her seat was beside him. To remove her would necessitate a scene so grotesque that it would define him for the remainder of his social life in the county. He would become the man who had his wife escorted from a ballroom. No political career, no estate, no seat in the House of Lords could survive that narrative. She knew it. He knew she knew it. And she knew he knew she knew it, which was the most unbearable part of all. The evening unfolded. Lord Whitmore approached first, a baronet of moderate fortune and immoderate kindness, who had always liked Cecily, and who now greeted her with the warmth of a man who did not care whether the Duke approved. "Your Grace," he said, bowing over her hand, "the room is improved immeasurably by your presence." He said it loudly enough that the Duke heard every syllable. Cecily smiled. "You are too kind, Lord Whitmore. I believe the room was already quite accomplished without me." "Accomplished, yes. Complete, no." She inclined her head in acknowledgement, and Lord Whitmore moved on, and the pattern was established. Over the next hour, a procession of guests approached the Duchess of Denim, some from genuine affection, some from curiosity, some from the irresistible social impulse to be seen near the center of the evening's drama. She received them all with identical composure. She asked after children by name, she remembered ailments, engagements, the particular shade of a gown worn at a previous event. She was, in short, magnificent, and the Duke sat beside her and watched it happen, with the expression of a man who had just discovered that the walls he had built to contain a situation had been, all along, made of glass. Lady Fairborn watched from across the room. She had positioned herself near the musicians, close enough to observe, far enough to deny surveillance. She had known Cecily since they were girls, had stood beside her at her wedding, had watched the light in her friend's expression dim over 4 years of marriage, to a man who treated companionship as an administrative inconvenience. She had sent the invitation knowing exactly what it was, She had received Mr. Ives's letter and dismissed it with the contempt it deserved. And now, she watched Cecily sit in her rightful chair and reclaim the room that her husband had tried to close to her, and she felt something that was not quite satisfaction, and not quite grief, but occupied the space between them where friendship lives. Supper was announced at 10 o'clock. The table had been set for 300, and the Duchess of Denim's place card, which Lady Fairborn's secretary had written out on Wednesday morning before Mr. Ives's letter had arrived, and which Lady Fairborn had personally insured, remained in place after it did, sat at the Duke's right hand. Cecily took her seat without comment. She unfolded her napkin. She tasted the soup. She complimented Lady Fairborn on the wine, which was, in fairness, exceptional. The Duke ate in silence. Not the comfortable silence of a man at ease, but the rigid silence of a man who understood that every word he spoke would be measured against the woman beside him, and found wanting. He cut his meat, he moved his fork, he performed the mechanics of a meal with the precision of a man who had forgotten what appetite felt like and was relying entirely on procedure. Cecily filled the space he had emptied. She spoke to the gentleman on her other side, a young MP whose name the Duke did not catch, about the proposed reforms to the poor laws, and her observations were so precisely informed that the young man set down his own fork and listened with the expression of someone who has just realized he is outmatched. She had read the committee report. It emerged. She had read the dissenting opinion. She had formed a view that the young MP admitted, with visible discomfort, was more nuanced than his own. The Duke heard every word. He could not help it. She was 3 feet from his right arm. He could smell her perfume, jasmine, and something underneath it, something green and private that he had once known the name of and had forgotten, the way he had forgotten so many things about her, that he was now being forced to remember in the worst possible setting. At one point during the fish course, the Countess of Bracewell leaned across the table and said, "Your Grace, we have missed you dreadfully at the Thursday concerts. Shall we see you this season?" And Cecily replied, "I believe you shall, Lady Bracewell. I have been practicing a new piece, Handel, and I shall need a sympathetic audience for the first attempt." The laughter that followed was warm and genuine, and included everyone at their end of the table, except the Duke, who was not laughing because he had not known his wife played Handel, and the realization of how much he did not know had begun to accumulate with the specific, physical weight of stones being placed one by one on a man's chest. After supper, the dancing resumed. Cecily danced the first set with Lord Whitmore, who acquitted himself admirably for a man of 63. She danced the second with the young MP, who acquitted himself less admirably but with enthusiasm. She danced the third with Colonel Ashburn, whose wife watched from the edge of the room with an expression of amused approval. She danced every dance that was offered, and every dance was offered, because by 10:30 it had become clear to every person in the Fairborn ballroom that dancing with the Duchess of Denim was the social act of the evening, and those who did not were simply those who had not yet found the courage to ask. The Duke did not dance. He stood at the edge of the floor with a glass he did not drink, and watched his wife move through the room he had tried to empty of her. He watched the candlelight catch the silver of her gown. He watched her laugh, a sound he realized with a sensation that felt like something tearing very quietly behind his ribs, he had not heard in over a year. He watched her hand rest on the arm of man after man after man, each one leading her into a dance he had not offered. At 11:30, the musicians began the final set, a waltz, Lady Fairborn's preference. Always a waltz to close, intimate and slow, the dance that required the closest hold in the steadiest hand. Cecily stood. She did not look for a partner, she simply stood, and the motion itself was enough to draw the attention of every person near the dance floor, because they had been waiting for this moment since 9 o'clock, and they knew, as audiences always know, that the evening's meaning would be decided in the next 30 seconds. The Duke set down his glass. He crossed the floor. He did not hurry. He did not hesitate. He moved with the unhurried precision of a man walking toward something he should have walked toward 8 months ago. And when he reached her, he extended his hand without speaking. Cecily looked at the hand. She looked at his face. She saw something there that she had not seen in 4 years of marriage, not tenderness, not apology, but recognition. The particular expression of a man who has just understood that the woman standing before him is not the woman he had filed away in his mind under adequate and forgettable, but someone else entirely. Someone who had walked into a room he had tried to bar her from and made it hers. She placed her hand in his. They danced. The waltz was simple, three-quarter time, the melody carrying them in circles that felt, to those watching, like the visible rotation of something that had been locked for a very long time. He held her correctly. She followed correctly. They did not speak. But his hand pressed against her back with a steadiness that said something words would have cheapened, and she allowed her weight to settle into the hold by a fraction, the smallest possible concession, the width of a breath. And it was enough. Lady Fairborn watched from beside the musicians. She did not smile. She had known Cecily long enough to understand that what she was watching was not a reconciliation. It was a beginning. The kind that only comes after a particular sort of ending, when both parties understand that what was broken cannot be repaired, but might, with extraordinary care, be built again from different materials. The music ended. The Duke released his wife. She curtsied, formal, correct, the curtsy of a duchess to a duke at a public ball. He bowed. They stood 3 feet apart in the candlelight, while 300 people held their breath, and then Cecily said, very quietly, "I shall return to the Dower House tonight." He said, "I know." She looked at him. "Will you instruct Mr. Ives to remove me from the next guest list as well?" Something moved behind his eyes. Not shame, exactly, but its cousin. The expression of a man who has just heard his own behavior described in a single sentence and found it smaller than he had imagined. "No," he said. "Then I shall see you at the next occasion." She left before he did. Her carriage was waiting. She had arranged it herself, because she had learned over 8 months of arranging everything herself that competence was not a consolation, but it was a foundation, and foundations were what you built on when everything above them had proven unsound. The Duke stood in the Fairborn entrance hall and watched her carriage lanterns disappear down the drive. He stood there long enough that a footman approached twice and was waved away twice. And when he finally turned back into the house, Lady Fairborn was standing in the corridor with her arms folded and an expression that contained no sympathy whatsoever. "She was extraordinary," Lady Fairborn said. "Yes, she has always been extraordinary. You simply were not in the room long enough to notice." He did not reply. He collected his coat and his hat and his dignity, such of it as remained, and he went home to a house that felt for the first time like a building rather than a residence. The hallway was dark. The candles in the entrance had burned low, and the footman who met him at the door took his coat with the careful neutrality of a servant who had heard from the kitchen staff, who had heard from the Fairborn kitchen staff, exactly what had happened at the ball. He climbed the stairs. He passed the Duchess's chambers. The door was closed as it had been for 8 months, but the scent of fresh flowers reached him through the wood. Mrs. Quell had never stopped placing them there. Lilies in winter, roses in spring, and now, in the warmth of early summer, something he could not identify. Sweet and persistent, and entirely unlike anything he would have chosen, which meant it was exactly what Cecily would have wanted. He had never asked why Mrs. Quell continued the arrangement. He understood now. The housekeeper had been keeping the room alive because she had understood long before the Duke had that the absence was temporary. Not because reconciliation was certain, but because a woman like Cecily Stowe did not disappear. She simply chose when to return. The following week, the Duke of Denim did something he had not done in 8 months. He walked to the Dower House. He did not send a note. He did not instruct Mr. Ives to arrange a meeting. He walked across the south lawn, through the walled garden, past the rose beds that Cecily had planted in November, and that were now in the fullness of early summer, producing blooms of such reckless beauty that the gardener had taken to showing them to visitors as though they were his own achievement. She was sitting at her writing desk when he arrived. She did not stand. She looked at him through the window for a moment, measuring perhaps whether the man walking toward her door was the same man who had written 3 lines to erase her from a room, or someone different. And then she returned to her letter. He knocked. She called him in. He stood in the doorway of a cottage that contained everything she had taken from their marriage. Her books, her desk, her tea service, the small watercolor of her mother that had hung in the upstairs corridor, and that he had never once looked at closely enough to know what it depicted. And he said, "I should like to call on you properly, if you would permit it." She set down her pen. "Call on me." "Yes. You wish to call on your own wife?" "I wish to begin again. And beginning requires asking." She considered this. The roses outside the window seemed to drink in the afternoon light. She could hear the gardener at work, the real one, not the phantom Farron denied sending. And somewhere beyond the garden wall, a thrush sang with the unburdened confidence of a creature never removed from any guest list. "Tuesday," she announced. "You may call on Tuesday." "I take tea at 4. He nodded, but offered no smile. She wouldn't have trusted one, not yet. Yet, something in his posture shifted, a subtle release of tension that only a woman who had spent 4 years deciphering his silences would have noticed. He turned and walked back across the south lawn, and Cecily watched him go, allowing herself not uncomplicated hope, but a flicker of curiosity, which she suspected was close enough. He came on Tuesday, he came on Thursday, he came the following Tuesday. Each visit lasted precisely the duration of a cup of tea, 40 minutes, no more. And in those 40 minutes he asked her questions he'd never posed in 4 years of marriage. What she read, what she thought of the tenant reforms he was proposing in the House of Lords, whether she preferred the south garden or the walled garden, whether the roses were hers. "Of course they are mine," she said on the third visit. "Whose else would they be?" He looked at the blooms through the window. "I didn't know you gardened." "You didn't know a great many things." "No," he conceded, "I didn't." On the 5th visit, it rained. The cottage windows streamed, and the drumming of water against the old stone walls created a privacy that fine weather never could. Cecily poured his tea as she always had, strong, no sugar, a 1/4 inch from the brim. He watched her hands and realized she had always known how he took his tea, and he had never once known how she took hers. He looked at her cup. Milk, a half-spoonful of honey. The honey jar sat on the shelf beside the window, its lid mended with glue, and looking at it he understood. This was a life, small, complete, self-sufficient, built without him. And its building was not an accusation, but a fact, and facts were harder to argue than accusations. "Honey," he said. She looked at him. "I beg your pardon? You take honey in your tea." "I've always taken honey in my tea." He set down his cup. He did not apologize. She would not have accepted one, and he was slowly learning that what she required was not contrition, but attention, a thing both simpler and infinitely more difficult. "Tell me what else," he said. She studied him for a long moment, the rain continuing its patter against the windows. "I dislike gooseberries," she said. "I read before I sleep, always, never less than an hour. I cannot bear the sound of a clock ticking in a bedroom. I prefer lavender soap to rose, though every gift I have ever received has been rose, because no one has ever asked." He was quiet. Then, "Lavender? Yes, I shall remember." "We shall see," she said, and poured him more tea, and the afternoon held them there until the rain stopped and the garden shone. By the 4th visit he stayed for an hour. By the 6th, Mrs. Quelch had begun setting 2 places for tea at the Dower House without being asked, and Farron had stopped pretending the gardener was not his doing, simply adding the cottage beds to the estate's maintenance schedule. In August, the Dower House was closed, not with drama, no ceremony, no pronouncement. Cecily's books returned to the library. Her writing desk was placed in the morning room beside the window that overlooked the south lawn. Her watercolor of her mother was rehung in the upstairs corridor, and the Duke stood before it for 10 minutes, seeing for the first time that the woman in the painting wore the same expression Cecily adopted when deciding if someone deserved her patience, an expression he now understood he had been the subject of far more often than he had earned. Mr. Ives tendered his resignation in September, citing personal reasons. Cecily, who understood the real ones with the accuracy of a woman who had spent 8 months unraveling all that was left unsaid, accepted with grace, providing a reference so warm that Mr. Ives found employment within a fortnight, and never mentioned the letter to Lady Fairborn's secretary. She didn't need to. Some debts are not collected, they are simply known. The following June, a daughter was born at the great house. They named her Frances, after no one in particular. Cecily had wanted a name that belonged entirely to the child, not to the family's history of expectations. The christening was held at the parish church, and Lady Fairborn stood as godmother, holding the infant with the confident authority of a woman who had been waiting for this role since the wedding, and intended to execute it with vigor. At the reception afterward, Lady Fairborn found the Duke standing alone in the garden. He was watching Cecily through the drawing-room window. She was laughing at something the vicar's wife had said, and the sound carried through the open casement into the warm afternoon air. "You are staring," Lady Fairborn observed. "I am. You should go inside and be with your wife and daughter." "I will, in a moment." Lady Fairborn followed his gaze. "She was always this. You understand that. You did not create what you see now. You merely stopped preventing it." He was quiet for a long time. "I wrote to her father once," he said, "before the separation. 3 lines. I told Mr. Ives to have her removed from your guest list with similar economy." He paused. "I've spent a year attempting to understand how I became a man who could reduce a woman like Cecily to 3 lines on a page." "And have you succeeded?" "No. I have only succeeded in understanding that the failure was total and that its correction will take considerably longer than its commission." "Good," said Lady Fairborn. "That is the correct answer." She went inside. After a moment, the Duke followed. Cecily looked up as he entered, not with surprise, not with expectation, but with the steady attention of a woman who had once sat beside a man in a room he had tried to empty of her and had decided, with the same quiet authority with which she decided everything, that the room was hers. He sat beside her. Frances slept in Lady Fairborn's arms. The afternoon light came through the windows and laid itself across the floorboards like a benediction, and in Mr. Ives's former study, a drawer contained nothing of consequence. They arrive here like a name spoken aloud in a crowded room whenever they are ready.